Time now to explore the economy. I'm joined by Mervin Jebaraj, economist and director of the Walton College of Business Center for Business and Economic Research. Mervin, when we last spoke, we were waiting on the latest GDP figures. We got that first reading of second quarter GDP at 4.1%. It's 4.2% now under the revised. Peel back the numbers and explain why that number was as strong as it was.
Right, we haven't seen this pace of growth rate in GDP at least since about 2014 when we had 2 quarters about 5% growth. So about 4.1%, much faster growth rate than the first quarter when we grew about 2.2%. So when we look at what really generated all of that growth, it's down to just pretty much one thing, and that's consumer expenditures. It's people like you and me and all of our viewers going out and spending more on goods and services in this economy. And really consumers have been the key driver of this economic growth since the last recession, and they really had a monster quarter in terms of spending. So what that tells me going forward is I got to ask whether consumers can really sustain this pace of growth going forward, because when you look at how much consumers spent in the first quarter, it was much lower than what they did in the second quarter, but given that huge jump, that you have to wonder if consumers have spent as much as they could possibly spend to stimulate this economic growth. Now, of course, consumers' wallets are a little bit heavier with those tax cuts that passed at the end of 2017, but along the same time that those tax cuts went into effect and people got a little more take-home pay, you've seen gas prices go up as well. So consumers, the average consumer loses about half their paycheck to that increase in gas prices that we've seen this year. So it'll be important to watch that number to see whether consumers can truly sustain this pace of economic growth, or if we drop back to the more tepid 2.5%, high 2% growth that we've seen in recent quarters. The other piece that did really well, obviously, was government expenditures. The federal government added about $300 billion in extra expenditures, so that's another little bit of stimulus there. So the two pieces that really drove this particular 4.1% growth were a little demand-side stimulus from the consumers and a little extra fiscal stimulus from government spending. The flip side, we saw a really big increase in exports. That isn't to say that the trade wars were working, but more or less it was various producers across the United States took all they had in inventory, put them in a ship, and sent them out of the country before the retaliatory tariffs hit. So you saw a 1 quarter increase in exports, which was matched almost entirely by a decrease in inventory. So it looks like producers took everything they had and shipped it out of the country and emptied out the inventories. Now, it'll be interesting to see in the next few quarters if producers refill those inventories, especially to satiate domestic demand, and that will tell us what producers are thinking about general economic conditions here in the United States. The one piece that was truly disappointing in this report was a slowing down in the rate of business investment spending, which, if we remember, the big impetus for the corporate tax cuts from 35% to 21%, again passed in December last year, was to spur business investment spending. It was lower in the first quarter than it had been in the second half of 2017, and that pace slowed down even more in the second half of 2018. So that piece was definitely not good news, because we want to see businesses use these tax cuts and increase investment spending. So we're not sure if they're worried about the domestic economy, worried about all the effects of the tariffs and retaliatory tariffs, and there's a lot of uncertainty there. But nonetheless, to see a sustained growth rate at this level, you're going to have to see a lot more business investment spending.
Big news potentially this week with the trade agreement with Mexico, the new NAFTA. In short, it returns tariffs on agriculture to 0%, which is where they were before the president sparked a trade war. The better news appears to be related to manufacturing. What's positive, what's negative in the outline that's been shared?
So we have some key principles that the administration has shared, and it remains to be seen whether all of those remain the way they are. Obviously, NAFTA has 3 countries involved: Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So Canada was not part of these negotiations between the United States and Mexico, because the United States and Mexico really had a lot more issues to iron out than both partners did with Canada. So we'll have to see what the final draft is before we pass any judgments on what this means. But there are a couple of provisions in there that look good for not just the United States and Mexico, but for Canada as well. And one of those have to do with how much of a car part needs to be made by workers making over $16 an hour. So theoretically, this benefits Canada and the United States more than it does Mexico. And so we'll have to see if that provision sticks. We'll have to see if that does produce more car manufacturing jobs in Canada and the United States, or if supply chains are just reoriented where, higher value products are made in Canada and the United States, and the rest is made in Mexico to keep up with that wage increase requirement. The other piece of this, again, that benefits Canada, the United States, and Mexico is that the requirement that 75% of the car parts need to be made within these three countries. So that obviously helps manufacturers of cars and car parts within these three countries. So those two pieces should improve car manufacturing across Canada, United States, and Mexico. Of course, that is contingent, on Canada entering this trade deal. We have seen threats that if Canada does not participate in the trade deal, we'd see tariffs imposed on Canadian cars, which I think would be fairly counterintuitive, because on the one hand, if you increase the requirement for more parts to be made in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and then turn around and slap tariffs on final finished cars from Canada, that does affect the demand for those particular parts that are made in the United States and in Mexico. So I don't think we would necessarily come out ahead in such a scenario. The other piece of this is, in all of the retaliatory tariffs, some $339 or so million worth of tariffs imposed on just the state of Arkansas. About $225 million of that is from Canada. So that affects industries across eastern Arkansas and southern Arkansas, and manufacturing and paper and metals. So it is important to see if, before Friday this week, the negotiations with Canada will reach some fruition, because those tariffs have been particularly affecting Arkansas.
And it still has to go through congressional scrutiny, so at this point it's preliminary. Let's talk wages. Two questions. Tax cuts were supposed to lead to increased wages as companies got a tax break. Number one, is that happening? And secondly, we have some detailed first quarter wage data. What does it show for Arkansas?
So let me look at your second question first. What the wage growth shows in Arkansas is, a lot of volatility on quarter-to-quarter information. So at the beginning of last year, Washington County had significant wage growth. So at the beginning of this year, compared to the beginning of last year, it looks a whole lot slower, and that is to be expected. We couldn't possibly sustain those levels of wage growth in Washington County, and Benton County did the same thing in the previous years. So Benton County had a really significant increase in wages in one quarter, and then when you compare that a year later, obviously it looks a whole lot lower. So that's, that volatility on a quarter to quarter is not what concerns me at all. What does concern me, however, is that wages in general haven't kept pace, once you account for inflation, haven't kept pace, and that is a long-term problem that really hasn't been improved upon. And so when we look at these record low unemployment rates in Arkansas, we're still not seeing the wage growth associated with what one might think is record low unemployment rate. And I think in part because our labor force participation is still struggling here in Arkansas, here in Northwest Arkansas as well. So until we see that improvement in labor force participation rate, I don't think the wage growth in particular here in Arkansas would improve. Now, of course, looking nationally, there has been a lot of talk on both sides, whether there are going to be wage increases or not going to be wage increases from the tax cuts. But I think on both sides of the political aisle, people are probably jumping the gun on whether these tax cuts will generate wage increases, because so far we haven't seen them. But I don't think one should expect to see them just yet. So the theory behind how all this should work is we reduce corporate tax rates. Businesses have the incentive to increase investments in workers' productivity, and improvements in workers' productivity will then lead to wage increases. So first we need to see business investment in more capital to make workers more productive, workers get more productive, and get wage increases. So we haven't even seen the business investment go up. So if that doesn't happen, workers don't get more productive, workers don't get more wages. So that's a long term, we're looking at least 2 years before one could see the benefits of that, assuming we've started business investment right now, which we haven't. So there's a long time between now and when we could determine whether this helped improve wages by improving workers' productivity, but we're headed for quite a few headwinds in terms of trade, so it's not sure whether these business tax cuts will lead to more business investment, which will then in the future lead to wage increases. What we've seen so far has been just some bonuses and announcements around that, not anything significantly different than previous years, but again, that's because businesses haven't made the investment to improve worker productivity, which will actually lead to sustained wage growth.
Your latest Skyline report is out. Overall, home sales across Arkansas are trending just about even compared to last year statewide. That's not necessarily a bad thing, as we've had several years of some really strong year-over-year growth. But the Skyline report focuses on Northwest Arkansas. What's the latest survey suggest?
Well, a couple of different components. So when you look at the residential side in the Skyline report here in Northwest Arkansas, you'll see that the number of homes sold continues to increase. But the average price of a home sold, of course, Benton and Washington County had the highest priced homes on average in the entire state. That continues to be the case, and we're seeing some significant increase in the average price of a home. So in Washington County, that increase over the last 5 years has been something like 35%, something like 28% over the last 5 years in Benton County. There used to be a significant difference in prices between Washington and Benton County. They're a lot closer together, at least in the first half of this year. Benton County at $238,000, Washington County at $236,000. So when we think about housing affordability for people living here in Northwest Arkansas and people wanting to move here to Northwest Arkansas, you think about the fact that about 40% of the people moving to Northwest Arkansas, to Benton and Washington County, are coming from other counties within the state. When we have the highest average home price, that does make Northwest Arkansas a little more unaffordable to all the people moving here from other parts of the state. So that piece is something that this region is working on trying to address to avoid problems that we've seen in other fast-growing cities. The other side of all this is on the commercial side, on the real estate. We're seeing a lot of activity in the office sector. Obviously, Walmart's building a new corporate headquarters here. A new swanky, if you will, corporate headquarters to try to compete with some of those big coastal companies like Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon, all of them with their beer fridges and table tennis and ping pong and bean bags and all of that stuff in their offices. So they're trying to build a nicer office to attract more millennials to work for them. Obviously, the supplier community working around them is improving their office space as well. So we're seeing a lot of demand for Class A office space, which then leaves the Class B office space, which is not nearly as nice as the Class A, but is still in really desirable locations available for smaller businesses and startups that don't quite have the money to invest in all these nice amenities within their building, but then they can use the common amenities like the trails and restaurants and bars and coffee houses that are close by to the Class B office space. So that particular office submarket is doing really well here in Northwest Arkansas, and the retail is surprisingly held up, even though we've seen Sears and Toys R Us go out of business here in Northwest Arkansas. Retail is being sustained by service sector industries like restaurants, nail salons, bars, and those types of businesses. So all in all, we're seeing a pretty stable market on the commercial side. The residential side is pretty hot right now, but it's something that we're trying to address.